right. Can you all see it? Good. So my contribution to the handbook was chapter 19, Online Pastoral Care. Um, and I thought substantially about foundations of what pastoral care is and how might we dialogue that with what we're experiencing now in digital spaces and where could there be edges or questions that animate this forward. I suppose I would say my contribution here is less prophetic and more summative. I would consider it maybe just kind of collecting the tradition and the baseline for ongoing further thought. And maybe some of that prophetic edge could come out in questions that you raise. So I first of all established in my chapter what I think pastoral care is vis-a-vis Christian practices, that I think pastoral care is very much constitutive of Christian identity and mission. It's not an added on, it's not an optional, but it's part of, at least coming from my tradition, who we are as Christians and what we do as Christians. It is an expression of faith. It expresses faith through care, welcome, accompaniment, presence, attentiveness, and some of the practices I will mention. Some of the biblical grounding or traditional grounding that I named in the chapter, and there could be others, but from my perspective, the image of the Good Shepherd, which predates Christianity, even going into the Jewish scriptures, as well as an emergent idea earlier in the church tradition of care of the soul or cura animarum, and how that found its way through the traditions into various expressions of ministry. And it is also sort of a litmus test, I would say, for the integrity of the community, that how the community cares for those in need, those in need, and how it is attentive to both the joys and the sorrows of where it finds itself is an integrity question, and very much we see this expressed through pastoral care practices. Certainly, this could be rounded out, but this was where I was coming from. So to define it, like I say in the chapter, I drew on cura animarum as particularly that care of the soul, but that doesn't mean it's disembodied. It's just that it's not just body. It's not just particular need, but it's always a larger holistic sense of what about the person's sense of relationship with God and self and others. I appreciated Alan Hugh Cole's distinction of soul care and storied care, which I highlight in my chapter, that soul care, coming from this idea of cura, is a relational orientation to God, but it's also storied. It's not out of just a subjectivity, but rather it's shaped by the broader Christian narrative. And so I appreciate the potential connection there to what Mary just presented. Also, I appreciate very much my recently retired colleague Kathleen Cahalan and her work defining pastoral care, pastoral ministry, where she particularly highlights the practices of healing, sustaining, guiding, and reconciling as core to pastoral care. Again, this could be rounded out, but how I established my approach. Okay. I like to add also another aspect of pastoral practice to this conversation. When we think of pastoral care, I don't know how often we also mention communication as a part of that in an intentional way. I like this intersection very much in my own research. A big voice in that in my Catholic tradition is Franz Josef Eilers, and certainly others have rounded this out, but he made the distinction that communication itself is a ministerial practice. So a really simple example of that I highlight is how we gather and talk and have meetings and engage on just on that level already is expressing faith and already can be ministerial. So for us to be intentional about how we gather and communicate and engage is not again an ancillary but part of who we are in identity and mission. So communication practices themselves enact ministry. Um, a beautiful grounding for that, one among many, is my sheep hear my voice from the Gospel of John, that there's a communicative aspect to shepherding, not just the binding of wounds and protecting from the wolves sort of thing. And the manner of communication alongside then functions as a theological witness. If we are poor communicators or careless communicators, that would mar who we are and our mission and identity and discipleship. So I like to round this out, paying attention to that, especially in ministerial formation. How are we engaged communicatively with one another, and how is it expressing who we are and what we're about in ministry? A word or two about digital culture as context, although I'll be brief here because it's the matter of the whole conference and there's some familiarity there. Nonetheless, for the chapter, I established that digital culture is not apart and something distinct, but integrated into the daily life and practice. It's the ambience we find ourselves in. Some of it is face to face, some of it is mediated, some of it is augmented, and now these days, some of it's also automated by way of different technologies. So it's a totality of experience that has these kinds of modalities. I pointed out that COVID and the pandemic accelerated how we think about digital pastoral norms. That I've been doing this for about 15 years, and before that, before the pandemic, I very much had to make the argument that this is relevant and it matters. And after the pandemic, people more or less saw in my pastoral ministry circles, oh, okay, this has this potential, this has this sort of necessity. And I would argue for and also notice that questions these days are less about whether and more about how to do acts of care, acts of accompaniment in these different kinds of modalities. Pastoral care online, or I would say maybe mediated, is not new, and it's not certainly something invented by the pandemic. We can go way back to telephone, we can go back to e-chaplaincy, we can go back to email-based care. And even before that, I put things like hotlines where people could engage in care or presence or attentiveness or accompaniment while not physically being there with another person. We can go even as back as correspondence and writing letters back and forth. That goes way back in the tradition. So I would just highlight that as maybe a legacy that this can find itself in. And throughout this, and as these mediated experiences of care have developed, some key concerns that bubble up tend to be question of presence and question of attentiveness. How do we pay attention to that while not physically together? How do we also pay attention to confidentiality and professionalism? I know in around 2002, this was one of the questions the Vatican dealt with when it thought about extending care online or through the computer in documents like church and internet, and as well as being sufficiently aware of nonverbal communication when in a mediated space. So, all in all, as we experience these kinds of mediated ways, there's always a call for a heightened attention to intentionality. I've noted COVID is a turning point, so I'll be brief here because I think this is familiar. But the experience of pandemic unsettled routine practices. We couldn't be face to face, and so other ways had to be created. Digital pastoral care countered isolation and distress. I think found a way to enter into these spaces. Not that it was doing it new, but it was new for the awareness of many that this could be possible. Many things like online support groups, online chaplaincy, outreach to groups that have been and continue to be in some ways marginalized became a bit more possible. And many would argue that pastoral workers functioned as essential caregivers during this time. So I would like to point to three maybe threads to close my presentation that continue to animate this conversation. One is the idea of individualized care. When thinking about pastoral care practices in digital spaces, there is an aspect to this where, as you all know, people in online spaces or augmented or digital spaces have the ability to kind of pastiche together content, resources, encounters that's according to their interest. This is no longer bound by traditional communal frameworks and boundaries around that. So when we're thinking about pastoral care, this doesn't necessarily have to come out of traditional frameworks for people. They may just encounter a resource and go with it. This low barrier is also a positive thing, but then what does it mean for our traditional understandings of care as an expression of community and mission and identity? It no longer has to be for the person who engages with it. So there's some risk here of detachment from communal formation and communal authority, which has its positives and its challenges. It's definitely, though, beyond the bounds of congregational settings. So that's a question that's emergent that we might deal with. Another development here maybe is around artificial intelligence that as we have, and we've spoken about this at this conference, that there could be a lot of ways that AI supports technical pastoral tasks. such as scheduling, intake, documentation, translation services. So this could be something that benefits the experience. There are, though, as you well know, ethical tensions about chatbot and relational aspects that are in fact interacting with a digital entity and not a human. So what is our ethics around that? Um, there's too a risk of replacing embodied pastoral mediation. And this is a question that continues to call for theological and ministerial discernment. We see this in the Roman Catholic tradition very recently in the encyclical that came out, Magnificat Humanitas. How do we think about the possibilities, but also kind of define the boundaries of what is a relational interaction that is deeply human? I would also maybe the last one to point out is gamification. This is interesting to me because you see this in many of the faith-based or prayer apps in a Roman Catholic tradition. One popular one is Hello, that uses technologies and interfaces that are gamified to motivate people to engage with spiritual practices, such as goal setting, tracking, incentives, daily streak that you can extend with your prayer. Um, this has this is present in wellness and spiritual apps, not just Hallow, but like Calm and other one meditation apps to keep the person engaged. Mary and others have talked about the attention, capturing the attention economy. So this also is an expression of that. Beyond tracking, it actually has games. So I know Hallow has a daily trivia, it has a word puzzle, it has other things you can access like that. So that to me continues to be interesting. It motivates people, it gets people to come back. There's an aspect of choice or agency, kind of. We could debate that. But of course, that is also very reductive and instrumentalizes care and spirituality into these concrete activities that you do. So I'm interested in continuing to explore the relationship around that. Is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? How do we integrate something like this into a broader program of care? I would like to close by naming some considerations that I think are open and should be before our eyes as practitioners and people that think about this and do this kind of work. So again, my one of my favorite themes to continue to return to the idea of communication as in and of itself ministerial and in and of itself pastoral care. So how are we attentive about our words, our interactions, our presence, our our total relational posture toward another and the sharing of that before we get to the content of what we're saying. I think this endures and continues to be an important question. The question of the body, and that I returning to that cura animarum of the body and soul as integrated and whole, and how to remain attentive to that in digital context, even if care may look like this, like the meeting we're having right now. How can we integrate breath and posture and just an awareness of we are all sitting in front of a device, and how does that shape this interaction? Naming that, being attentive to that. I'm coming from a Benedictine context here in Minnesota, and so something that is really interesting to me is contemplative practice vis-a-vis formation. And I think there's a lot of work that we can do around communicative practices in a contemplative mode when we help people who are entering into ministry be attentive to that, such as listening, presence, hospitality, esteeming silence, and these kinds of things. I would name these not as over against the aspects of digital culture, but rather to foster appreciation for these and to learn to bring them into digital spaces as another kind of more intentional modality. And then finally, I mentioned in the chapter interruptions. Digital attention, as we know, is both economized but also multifaceted and can be scattered. So, how do we think about attention in that scattered way and think about that as a pastoral opportunity? In conclusion, in the chapter, I landed the airplane, if you will, by proposing that digital pastoral care online is not a lesser substitute, but invites us in this hybrid ecology of care to be intentional about how we are relational, how are we communicative in the mode of ministry and presence, how are we attentive to the body, and how are we forming people toward these realities, so that if it's this space, how do we do that as well as we can? And where can there be some creative edges to that, in fact, that wouldn't have been there in person? Where does that actually open up doors? I appreciate your attention. Like Mary, I too am looking forward to the conversation, and this is the contact information I put up in case you'd like to continue the conversation with me in another context.